Hey there friends, Andrea Walford here from Make Beautiful Cards. In this video, I'm going to show you how to create this You Make Me Happy card featuring Stampin' Up's Butterfly Bijou 6x6 patterned paper and the Pretty Perennials stamp set. So the first thing that we need to do is to prep our butterflies. And I'm going to be using this patterned paper sheet that you see here from the Butterfly Bijou 6x6 Designer Series paper pack. Now there's two ways that you can cut out your butterflies. You can do it by hand using scissors like you see here. And if you're going to do that, then I suggest you watch my YouTube video, How to Fussy Cut Like a Pro, because it shares all sorts of tips and tricks for getting great results with your fussy cutting. Your other option, if you like to do a lot of fussy cutting like I do, is to use a machine like the Brother Scan & Cut. And this is a machine that I recently invested in because I do a huge amount of fussy cutting on my cards, and I have for years. So it just made sense for me to take the next step and invest in the machine. Now, because I have the machine to do the cutting for me, like it can cut out all the butterflies on this sheet in about a minute. In terms of setting up the machine, it maybe takes me 2 to 3 minutes total from start to finish. So because of that, I'm actually going to go ahead and I'm going to cut out all the whole butterflies on each pattern paper sheet here. So you can see here, there's 6 butterflies that I can cut out. And then that way I just set them aside and I can use them in making a whole bunch of cards. And I don't have to do this step every single time I want to sit down and make a card. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to cut these out, and then once I've done that, I'll be back to show you what they look like. So I'm back from my cutting machine and you can see all my butterflies. So the one that I'm going to be using for this card is the pink butterfly that you see here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the remnant of my pattern paper piece from which I cut my butterflies, and I want to cut the edge that you see here. So for that, I'm going to take my paper trimmer. And I want this to be 3/4 of an inch. So this pattern paper piece is 6 inches, so I'm going to cut this at 5 1/4 inches. Actually, I think I might be able to cut it a little bit more. Let's cut it at 5 1/8 of an inch and just see how we do here. Yep. 5 1/8 of an inch. Now, if you're hand cutting your paper, hand cutting your butterflies instead of using a machine like I did, then what you're going to want to do is when you get your pattern paper piece, before you start cutting anything, you're going to want to cut your patterned paper at 5 1/8 of an inch so that you end up with this pattern paper strip that's 7/8 of an inch wide. Now I'm going to trim this pattern paper strip down to the size of my card front. And I'm going to trim it from both the top and the bottom because I want this to be 5 1/2 inches. So I'm going to cut 1/4 inch off of the bottom, and then I'm going to rotate it and I'm going to cut 1/4 inch off of the top so that this ends up being 5 1/2 inches. And usually I'll trim it just a little bit longer because I prefer to trim any overhanging edges. It's better to over trim than under trim. So here you can see I have my patterned paper piece. So now I have here a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of white cardstock, and I'm going to be dry embossing it with my Painted Texture 3D embossing folder. So I'm going to place it into my folder like so, and then I'm going to run it through my die cutting machine. Once I've done that, I'm going to trim it so that it is 3 5/8 of an inch, but then I'm going to keep the height at 5 1/2 inches. So once I've done that, I will be back. So here you can see what my embossed piece looks like. So I'm just going to set that aside, and now I'm going to take my Wild Rose dies, and I'm going to take the label that comes with that die and this piece of white cardstock, and I'm going to take this label, I'm going to stick it to my cardstock piece, and I'm going to run this through my die cutting machine. Next, I'm going to prep my happy greeting. So I'm going to be using the Pretty Perennials stamp set, and I'm going to be using this greeting that says happy. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stamp it onto black cardstock using Whisper White craft ink, and then I'm going to heat emboss it using white embossing powder. Now, what I like to do is, because I'm planning on making a lot of cards using this happy greeting, I like to save myself some time by stamping, embossing, and cutting a bunch of these images out at the same time. So I'm just going to show you how I do that. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my embossing powder tool. I'm then going to take my embossing powder tool and I'm going to rub it all over my cardstock piece. Now I can only stamp a certain number of greetings at the same time and emboss them. I can't actually do the entire sheet simply because I don't want the ink to dry before I'm able to stick the embossing powder. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work as quickly as I can, and I'm going to stamp 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's see if I can get away with stamping 6, 5, 6. And I'm going to place this over a coffee filter, and I'm going to sprinkle on embossing powder. So let's start with the right hand side first, and then I'll slide this over and we'll do the left hand side. And then I'm carefully going to flick the back, and you can see if you do a good job applying your embossing powder tool all over, then you'll have minimal flecks to clean up afterwards. So here you can see I was able to go ahead and stamp 6 of these. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my heat tool and I'm going to heat emboss all of them. So here you can see what my heat embossed pieces look like. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim off my excess cardstock here. And I'm going to go ahead and cut these out. Now, up until recently, I would have cut these out using my paper snips, and I would have done it by hand. And if you're fussy cutting by hand, then I recommend you watch my How to Fussy Cut Like a Pro video on YouTube, because it shares some tips and tricks for getting great results with fussy cutting. Now recently, I treated myself to a Brother Scan and Cut. It's an electronic cutting machine, and it will actually cut these out for me, leaving a nice small border around it. So it makes cutting out lots of these images really quick, which is why I've actually gone ahead and stamped so many of them. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to cut these out, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. So here you can see what all my die cut pieces look like. So I'm going to set aside the one that I'm going to be using for this card, and then I'll put the others aside for other projects that I will be creating. So I'm now going to prepare the greeting that I'm going to be pairing with the word happy. Once again, I'm using the Pretty Perennials stamp set, and I'm going to stamp 3 greetings because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm prepping for a bunch of different cards, so I figured I might as well stamp them all at once, and I'll show you how I do that. So I'm going to be using the greeting birthday, for you, and you make me. So my strip of black cardstock is secured to my grid paper using a repositionable adhesive, just so it doesn't shift as I'm stamping. I'm taking my embossing powder tool, I'm patting it liberally all over my cardstock piece, and then once you've done that, you don't want to touch your cardstock anymore. So I'm now going to grab my white craft ink pad and my greetings. So I'm trying to align them fairly close to the bottom of my cardstock piece. So I've stamped the greeting birthday twice, I've stamped the for you twice, and the you make me. So now I'm going to grab my coffee filter, and I'm going to sprinkle on embossing powder on all my greetings. So there you can see how that looks. Now it looks like one of my for you has a lot of embossing powder. It's going to be challenging to clean that off. So what I'm going to do is I'm very quickly going to stamp another for you and maybe another birthday. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to emboss all of those. Now if you do have any stray flecks of embossing powder, you can try to get rid of them with a little paintbrush. but that should be good. So I'm going to heat emboss these now, and I will be back to show you what it looks like when they're done. So here you can see what all my greetings look like. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this apart. So I'm going to place it on my guillotine style trimmer, and I want to cut it right down the middle of this piece. And then I'm going to trim each individual word separately. Then what I like to do before I actually start the trimming process is I like to just cut them apart. So once you have all your pieces cut apart, you can then start trimming them. Now to help me get an even straight trim around, I always use my little guillotine trimmer. This Tonic Studios one, this small size one, is a great size for this. And I use the edge of the plastic guide to help me figure out where I'm going to cut. So what I make sure is that my letters, I can just see the very tip of my letters past the edge of the plastic guide. So I start with the side usually. So I align the top edge of my strip onto or with one of the lines on my platform. Then I make sure the letter is either just aligned with that plastic, with the edge of that plastic guide, or sticking out slightly. It's a little bit fidgety, of course, because the paper ends up pretty much being completely covered by the plastic guide. But I always get great results doing it like this. So I'll do the sides first, then I'll flip this. Now just the one trick when you're doing this, in addition to using your plastic guide to align it, is that the paper can slip easily. So you really want to make sure that you're holding on to the plastic guide just on top of where the paper is. And of course you keep your fingers out of the way of the blade. So there you can see I have a perfectly trimmed greeting. So now I'm just going to go ahead, I'm going to trim the rest of my greetings, and then I'll be back to show you what they look like. So here you can see I've trimmed all my greetings, and I discarded the ones that didn't have a nice clean stamped impression. Now the greeting that I'm going to be using for this card is the You Make Me. So I'm going to set the other ones aside. And we're now ready to start assembling our card. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my patterned paper piece, and I want to, first of all, make sure that my card is aligned in the correct orientation. I can't tell you how many times I've accidentally stuck things on upside down. Because I want this, so this is a portrait orientation card, and I'm sticking my patterned paper strip along the left-hand side of the card, and I'm working directly on the card front. So I want to make sure that this patterned paper piece is aligned with the edge of my card. So I'm going to flip it over so I can just take a look here. And I did cut my pattern paper piece a little bit longer than the card, so I'll be able to trim it at the top. Then once I'm happy with its placement, I'm going to take my adhesive and stick it down like so. And then I can go ahead and I can take my scissors and use the top edge of my card to align my cut. Now I'm going to take my embossed panel and I want to align that as well. Now this one, I'm going to make sure it's aligned with the top edge of my card, so that if there's anything that I need to trim, it's going to be easy along the bottom and I don't risk accidentally cutting the crease or the fold of my card. So once I'm happy with the placement of my paper, then I go ahead with my tape runner. And for this, because it's an entire panel, I like to make sure that my adhesive is close to the edge of the paper. Now I'm going to flip this. Here you can see, if I open it up, it overhangs just a tiny little bit. So I'm just going to go ahead and trim that, and then I will be back. So I've trimmed down my panel. Now I'm going to take this Blushing Bride metallic ribbon, and I want to cut a piece that's about 5 inches. Well, maybe I'll cut it just a little bit bigger. Now I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to cut it in half. Then I'm going to flip my pieces over, and I want to overlap just one end of them, so it's going to be kind of like in a V shape, like so. And I don't necessarily want that V to be too big, so you can see the two ends are fairly aligned. And to hold them together, I'm going to use a glue dot. Now I'm going to take some fabric scissors, and I want to cut each of my ends on an angle like so. And then let's grab our label, and I'm going to place some Stampin' Dimensionals at the back. Now I'm not removing the position of the dimensionals yet, because the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to be determining its placement so that I can stick down my ribbon. So I'm placing a glue dot on the back of my ribbon piece, and then I'm placing my label on my card. Now I want it overhanging, and I want the tips of this label to stick out. And by the way, this label, in case you don't have this exact label, it is about 3.5 inches by about 2 3/8 of an inch. Well, yeah, about 2 3/8 of an inch. So I want to position it so that it's overlapping my card, and it's going to be sticking up from the bottom about 3/8 of an inch. And then of course you do want to make sure that it's straight. Then for my ribbon, I want it to basically be straight or even with, aligned with this straight edge of my label. So being careful I don't press down that glue dot so that my ribbon doesn't stick. As long as you haven't pressed it down, you can still align it. There we go. And then let's just double check that this is going to be straight. So I want it up a little bit. Then when you're happy with the placement, you can go ahead and stick that down. So now I'm going to remove the backing from my Stampin' Dimensionals. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to stick that label down. Now for my butterfly, I'm going to place some double-sided adhesive along the bottom of the butterfly, and then I'm going to grab my Stampin' Dimensionals, and I'm going to place one at the back of the right wing, and then a double dimensional at the back of the left wing. And now I'm going to angle this and stick it down like so. So now for the happy greeting, we're going to use some of my liquid glue. So I want to make sure, because I'm going to be tucking the secondary portion of the greeting slightly below the top of the letters, I do want to make sure that as I'm applying my glue, I don't go right to the top of the 2-letter P's or the top of the Y. So you can see I've gone ahead and stuck it down. And then I'm going to place some adhesive at the back of my greeting, or the second portion of my greeting. And I want to tuck this so that it's just a little bit underneath the P, because I don't want the top of my letters to cover any portion of this greeting, but I do want it to look like it's connected. And then just making sure that it is straight. So the last thing that we're going to do is we are going to embellish this with a few of these sequins. These are from, I think it's called Artistry Blooms. I'm going to place a sequin here, and then I'm going to take 2 of these champagne rhinestones, which they're kind of like a yellowy, pinky, peachy color. And they coordinate nicely with this ribbon. So you can see I placed 2 small ones and then a medium rhinestone, medium sequin. And now I'm going to take a large sequin, and I'm going to tuck it slightly underneath the label. Then we'll place a medium sequin up here and a small champagne rhinestone right there. So there you have it, friends. You can see what our card looks like, and it's now finished.